All right, welcome to the slideshow. I'm Dakota Jackson. I'm a freelance trombonist here in New Orleans. I just got my master's degree in jazz studies and have an undergrad in trombone performance. And I'm just a big trombone nerd interested in creating a interest and appreciation of the trombone. I got my co-host Ben with me.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Wiltz. I am a grad school dropout and band director over here at Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. And I am a bass trombone player who is obsessed with trombone and everything about its history, literature, and just playing it.
All right. Well, what do you got going on this week, Ben?
So this past week has been pretty eventful. I had my folks come up, visit for a bit, and I guided quite a bit this week, and fishing was great. So, and those who don't know, I'm a fly fishing guide up here, and so had a pretty good week guiding, and so I can't really complain. No music. I've got some news about that, which I'll say a little bit later, but other than that, yeah, not much, man. How about you?
I mean, I've been good. I've been trying to get back into my routine. I've had some people visit, so I haven't been able to get super on it. I have already, though, applied for a job giving lessons, and I think I've got the all good on that. I'm going to be doing that pretty soon. Just got to get through some references and some paperwork, but I'm super stoked about that. I'm not sure how many students I'll have starting here in COVID, but I'm sure it'll keep on increasing. And I'm really looking forward to working with, like just students and trying to get my teaching chops together. That's kind of an end goal for me, is to eventually be a professor somewhere and then be playing on the side. And right now I'm just sitting here doing this podcast, enjoying this smooth, delicious George Killian's Irish Red beer. George Killian, as a matter of fact, the original George, brewed his beer in 1864 for one simple reason: to drink and enjoy with his friends. Anyways, we're also looking for advertisements or any kind of sponsorship at this moment. What do you have this week for news, Ben?
Disclaimer: we are not at all affiliated with Killian's.
Yeah.
However, we would love to be. In fact, I am drinking a Norfolk Brewing Company Easy Rider Lager. So, yeah, definitely open to any sponsors. News this week. News this week I was talking about really has to do with something more close to home for me. So far, Arkansas just came under a mask mandate now. And with recent directives that they've given our school, it is looking like so far that wind instruments will not be permitted to play. Now, this may change, and we're still waiting on guidelines. However, I'm pretty much being told that my band may not be able to play this year at all, which I do understand some of the reasoning. I'm not necessarily against the idea of us stopping the spread of COVID. However, it's just kind of a bad situation, and I don't know. I think it goes to say, like, you really need to take advantage of those opportunities you get to play in a group or be in front of a group, because, man, I don't know how long it's going to be till I get to do that again. And that's kind of a bummer, but that's more of my recent news. Not necessarily great news, but so far up here in Arkansas, it's not looking great for us wind players when it comes to playing in groups, at least in the school level. So I hate that that's a bummer, but I hate to be a bummer about that. But I mean, that's kind of the state of things at the moment.
Yeah, man, that's tough for sure. And man, I feel for you. And obviously, as a musician over here, it's been tough too. I've had a lot of friends making some tough decisions on staying here, on when things are going to come back, on career choices. So this is a difficult time, and I just want to urge anybody. We're not going to be kind of doom and gloom this whole time in the pod, but if you need help, reach out, because that's one thing that's helped me, and I'm sure it's helped Ben. This podcast, for example, just talking to Ben every week and being in communication with people. So just always feel free to talk to people. So this week we're going to be doing a bass trombone specific episode. I'm going to let Ben take the lead since he is a bass trombonist. You know, I like to say that I am a pretend bass trombonist since I fake playing trombone quite frequently. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit too in the history of that. But I play bass trombone in a big band in town, and I'm actually just playing my concert horn. I have thought a lot about getting a bass trombone recently, and so I'm going to try and bounce things off of Ben as well. But yeah, Ben, just talk to us about, what we're going to be kind of going into this week on the bass trombone.
Yeah, so specifically with the bass trombone, we're going to discuss kind of configurations. So I'm not wanting to go into so much the history of the bass trombone or even its application as I am just kind of the nuts and bolts of if you're getting a bass trombone, kind of what to look for. So we'll talk about, a single versus double bass trombone. We'll talk about whether or not you should get independent or dependent horn. We'll talk about the different tunings, and we'll just do a quick rundown on balance. So to start things off, we're going to talk about kind of deciding and just discussing the different uses of a single bass trombone versus a double bass trombone. And for those of you who don't know what I'm saying by that, might be one or two who have been sheltered, never seen a bass trombone in their life. I doubt so in this podcast. However, what I'm talking about is a bass trombone that is usually tuned in B flat with a single attachment in F versus a bass trombone that might have two triggers, I guess you could say two attachments, two triggers, either dependent or independent, so inline or stacked. And talk about kind of the different uses there, because there was for a while pretty large debate over this. I think for the most part, the community is on the same page on this subject, but it's a good way for us. It's a good debate to bring up or to bring back to light. So for those of you who don't know, like I said, the bass trombone first came out. It was as we know it anyways, a single bass trombone is usually in a 562 or 0.562 bore. Usually it has one attachment, and that attachment's usually keyed in F. It has been used in the bass trombone role and a lot of ensembles for a while that way. And most of the music that we have out there today was actually written with this bass trombone in mind. It wasn't until a little bit later that we started to see these second attachments start to make their way in the bass trombone world as ways to get around the fact that the bass trombone went from being keyed in F to B flat. Those of you who don't know, a bass trombone keyed in B flat and F, it's the exact same as your standard tenor trombone with an F attachment. Only difference is larger bore and maybe a larger bell, but very, very few differences in that. And so what you're really going for is just a different timbre. While the double bass trombone, we do extend the range of the instrument. And I believe something that's important is that we add some notes that aren't necessarily possible on a single bass trombone without messing with tuning slides and doing some things that you might not feel comfortable doing in the middle of a song or in a piece of music. Cody, do you have any, let's talk about the single horn some more. Do you have any player or any players that you know of who played almost exclusively on a single bass trombone that you could think of?
Yeah, for sure. The big one is George Roberts, Mr. Bass Trombone, actually. And I actually didn't know he was a big single guy until recently, because I was like kind of looking into, I play a lot of big band gigs, and when I get parts that are really bass trombone specific, they usually are for stuff that George played. Like I play a lot of Sinatra charts, and he did a lot of that. And so I was wanting to get kind of the same thing as him, and then I found out he only played a single trigger, and we'll kind of get into this, but I think I'm probably not going to get it. I think he played like a Con 70 in the beginning. Is that correct, Ben?
Uh, I believe so. I think a Con 70 or yes, he played Con 70. Okay.
Yeah, I know he played that 70, and then I know he like kind of went through olds and console, a couple other ones there. But those were all single trigger bass trombones. And there's some different reasons on that with why with George, but it's funny. If you go a little bit further back from even George, you get to Bart Barcelona, and I found this story like a couple years ago while I was kind of looking into the bass trombone development in big band, because I don't know if you're aware, but like, Ellington never had a bass trombone. He had three, and then no bass at all. It's just three tenors, and then Basie kind of got into a four with the bass. And then Stan Kitten famously had two bass trombones. So I was kind of curious as to how he started getting so bass trombone heavy. And Barcelona, the first guy to play bass trombone, this is kind of like a like an old legend story. So you can kind of there's definitely speculation to doubt what was actually happening. But the story goes that Barcelona, they were in a town. He went to a music shop, and he saw what he thought was a bass trombone because it was so huge. And he came back and told Stan, he said, I just got this, I think we should play this to kind of fill out the section. And Stan loved how dark it made everything. And this bass trombone was not even a bass trombone at all. It was like it's like a 545. It was just a concert horn, which is what I'm playing on. And funny enough, a lot of the big band I play is for like swing music and swing and like dance. And so modern stuff, it's really hard to kind of like fake it. But like on with the swing dance stuff, either A, there wasn't actually a bass trombone part and they're throwing one in there. So now it's like not actually that low because they're not trying to do anything crazy. Or it's covering a guy who was playing either like a concert horn or like a single trigger bass. I will say when I do get when I do get George specific parts, it does challenge me the most. I've made it a big goal of mine to get good at like faking the bass trombone, but tuning low C's and then God forbid low B's on the concert horn is never fun in eighth note runs. So yeah, that's kind of what I've got on the single, Ben.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I remember reading some of George's interviews, and pretty much, George started out before the double bass trombone really came to fruition and became modern practice. And there are some pictures of George with a double trigger bass trombone. However, George was very, very quick to say that he preferred a single, mostly because it didn't hurt his hand or shoulders much. He said that it was lighter for him. And I think there's some merit to that. I mean, if you're comfortable playing, you're going to play better. And I think that George strive for a little bit of simplicity in that. I think that's something to be admired. I will say, if you're looking for your only bass trombone, maybe a single might not be your best bet. Cody was just mentioning about how a lot of these old swing tunes, how they are pretty easy to cover with a single trigger bass trombone. But when we get into some more modern stuff, I think of any modern big band chart specifically, where the bass trombone often doubles the bari sax, or just sometimes even has lines with the trombones that have bombs. That's what we call them, where you just throw a pedal tone in between notes in there. I think when we get to those parts, the double trigger bass trombone really shines. I can think of a couple of pieces where I had low B naturals thrown in the middle of some unison lines I had with trombones. And I was thinking, wow, I am very thankful for the second attachment on my bass trombone right now. And I couldn't imagine actually using a single trigger bass trombone for that, even though there are plenty of people who could do it. I just know that when given the option, I don't think it's cheating to just throw yourself to equip yourself for the music at hand, especially when you know that music was written with that type of instrument in mind. But there's nothing wrong with owning a single trigger bass trombone. I actually have I've played on a Bach 50 that I really like, and I've decided that at some point I'm going to buy myself either one of those or a Con 70. I've always wanted a Con 70, like George, and I'm going to buy me a single trigger bass trombone. That could cover almost any gig that I might ever play. But I think what's neat about it is just like the same reason George said. It's a lighter instrument, and when you don't just need your big 2-attachment bass trombone with all the bells and whistles, it's a good way to be somewhat minimalist whenever you play these parts. So I definitely don't think it's a good only instrument, a single trigger bass trombone, but I do think it's a great instrument to have in your collection, especially if you're a bass trombone player who wants to own more than one.
Yeah, man. It's funny you mentioned the lightness thing, because we were kind of talking about before this, like, as a guy who plays a lot of, like, on a jazz trombone, a straight horn, pea shooter, whatever you want to call it, lightness is kind of a thing that I like. I prefer like a light slide and a light bell and everything. All my new setups are super light, and in comparison to a bass trombone that's just immensely heavier, I can definitely understand wanting to lighten that up a little bit. It's funny, I saw Brian Hecht, who plays bass trombone in the Atlanta Symphony, who's an incredible bass trombonist. Definitely go check him out if you get a chance. I saw he got his Con 70 back from the shop or something, so he owns one. And this will kind of segment us into the next section. But, a couple months ago, I was kind of on this kick that I wanted to buy a Con 70 because I thought, these are all my gigs where I'm playing bass trombone. This is what I'm imitating. This is the sound I want to get. But the other thing is that the other reason for me to own a bass trombone is so I can be a more complete teacher and teach it out. And because of that, Ben, you kind of steer me away from the Con 70. So do you want to kind of talk about why you think that as a teacher you shouldn't go with single necessarily as your only option?
Yeah, it all boils down to what the rest of the community is doing. I know we don't want to necessarily get ourselves too attached to what the rest of the world is doing or anything like that, but I think it's important as teachers to realize that we need to prepare our students for the world that they're going to be living in. And in the bass trombone world, you don't want to limit all of your students to be playing on single trigger bass trombones. That Con 70 would be great for just those applications. But if you had a bass trombone player who just went out and bought himself a 2-valve independent bass trombone and he was wanting to study with you, it would definitely be in your best interest to brush up on some of those alternate positions and things like that. Scale patterns are different whenever you're dealing with an independent bass trombone. You can play your scales with some alternate positions that might make things a good bit easier that you couldn't necessarily do with that single trigger Con 70. So there's a lot that you'd have to sit there and explain to your student, hey, you're on this horn, you can do this, I'll just do this, when it's a lot easier when you're in their shoes as you practice out and work out some of the kinks. You can tell that student how you overcame some of those issues because you dealt with the exact same thing. So it's more of a lowest common denominator thing. If you know most of the world is going to be playing on that independent bass, double valve bass trombone, then that's probably the type of platform you should be teaching from, and then branch out from there. Now, we can get into independent. I believe actually that's where we're going next, is the argument between independent and dependent horns. So that might be a good transition anyways. But yeah, I just think that I think from a teaching standpoint that you do need that relatability that comes with when you're dealing with your bass trombone specific students, knowing what their side of things is like. Because that Con 70, while it's great, there are some things that, like I said, it just can't do. something that I didn't mention is actually in the bass trombone world, it's very common to play tuba excerpts and etudes. And some of these tuba etudes can be very difficult on a single trigger bass trombone, and some of them can really make it to where it's clunky and almost unplayable because they're not written with slides in mind. And a double trigger bass trombone without any gaps in its range, like a single trigger would have, you're just able to actually play the music for what the music's worth and not worry about a lot of the technical issues too. That's something that I did leave out, was just doubling that tuba music. I know we all like to play trombone specific music, but I mean, realistically, if you're a bass trombone player, you're going to play tuba music. I could promise you that as well.
Yeah, man. So I have a couple things on the independent versus dependent right away. Personally, I don't feel near as strongly as Ben because it's never been a problem for me. I've never had to think about it. Two, it is our pod, so so I know there's a lot of dependent stands out there. One of which including the great Doug Yo, who is phenomenally better at trombone than either of us. It's not close. But I will say that unfortunately, no dependent stands are here to voice their opinion on it. And three, I kind of wanted to open up a rabbit hole. I know Ben feels strongly about this, and this might evoke strong feelings from from the sea of listeners out there. In fact, if it does, feel free to put all your opinions on this because I think that they look kind of cool, and I have considered getting one, but I have been met by hard opposition from Ben. So I just want to ask you, Ben, what your thoughts are on the King Duo Gravis.
Oh, okay. The King Duo Gravis. So I've had very little experience with the King Duo Gravis, but the one King Duo Gravis that I picked up, I'm not going to name the name of this forum that I have seen the praises of the Duo Gravis being sung about. However, it no longer exists. However, I do see these things echoed in a more modern version of said forum, which shall not be named. However, the King Duo Gravis, for those of you who don't know, is the King 6B, I believe. I think there was a 7B that was called the Duo Gravis for a bit. For the most part, though, if you pick up a King Duo Gravis, it's called a 6B. They're in all sorts of tuning arrangements, but what's the main thing about them is they are a dependent bass trombone. So what that means is that it does have two attachments, and the second attachment can only be engaged when the first attachment is also engaged. That is a kind of an odd concept to some, especially for somebody who started out on an independent horn. It was weird when I played on my first dependent horn. But the King Duo Gravis, I'll go back to that. What makes this horn unique is the fact that the triggers on this instrument are side by side.
Yeah, and for people listening who haven't seen one before, what do you mean when you say side by side? Like, where are they at in relation to the hands?
I mean, both triggers are activated with your thumb. That means your thumb has to be somewhat dexterous in order to play some harder passages, possibly. I believe there are people out there who have mastered this. However, I feel one of the reasons I feel so strongly against the Duo Gravis is the fact that it's a neat concept. I love the instruments themselves seem neat, but I feel like the whole trombone community is ruining a batch of horns that will never be the same because they realize that setup is so inferior that they feel the need to split the triggers up with a custom job rather than go out and buy another dependent horn if they choose. And so we're going to end up with a used market of nothing but custom job King Duo Gravises instead of as they were. And I do think there is something important about saying, hey, maybe there'll be one or two preserved. But I imagine in the next 30 years, every single duo gravis is going to have these split trigger setup, which is like, why would you get a duo gravis in the first place? So, of course, there are great arguments. Hey, you could have a great sounding duo gravis. I've heard people say they're a wonderful horn for a tenor player to double on. However, I think they are terrible for teachers for the same reason I talked about the single trigger bass trombone not being a great choice for teachers, is because if you have a serious bass trombone student, chances are he's not going to have a duo gravis. He's not going to be playing a lot of modern solos on his duo gravis. He'll probably have either a dependent or independent bass trombone with a typical thumb middle finger setup. That's just the modern approach to the bass trombone, and I think it's proven a lot more ergonomic than the duo gravis setup. So I'm glad you mentioned the duo gravis, Cody, because that is a problem instrument. The one I played, I will say I didn't get a fair shake at. Okay, it was a very old instrument that was supposedly redone by a local music shop. Like, they said that they completely renovated this thing, but it was in rough shape still. And it was tuned in F and E, so B flat, F, and E. So I kind of had some issues with that tuning as well, but we can discuss that. I mean, people listening to this podcast are probably going to lose it because of my overall negativity towards this thing, because it does have a cult following. But I'm not saying you're wrong unless you like the original trigger setup, which I guess you might be. I don't know.
Yeah, I will say, I do like, once again, if you're mad about any of these opinions, remember to direct your hate towards Ben, because I am not that impassioned about any of this. But I can see the appeal to the duo gravis, because it's like it seems to be kind of like the classic king bass trombone thing, and like in the same root as the 2B and the 3B having this classic sound or whatever. And so, I mean, if I'm being completely honest, and this might upset Ben, but if I see one for a good price, I don't know how strong I would be. I might, I could be easily swayed, for sure.
The triggers are going to be split too.
Perhaps. I mean, that's a good note, man. They don't make duo gravises anymore, right? That's like they're all vintage now, right?
Yeah, and they're just, that whole stock of duo gravises is just, eventually they're all going to have split triggers, which, while it's less ergonomic, I think it's kind of neat to leave these horns alone a little bit. Not everybody needs a custom job. I don't know. To me, it seems like we're going to lose kind of a generational horns by the end of it, man. Everyone I see for sale got split triggers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised that there's not more of them still around, with like the I mean, honestly, like I'm actually kind of surprised that didn't kind of start its own thing where a bunch of people did that, because I can see how, I don't know. So it's tough for me to say. Like, I don't play bass trombone. I can see how it kind of like, it seems kind of cool, and like, if are duo gravises pre-independent horns, or do you know?
They're dependent.
But were they made before?
To be honest, I do not have that information right in front of me. But the duo gravis, like that side trigger setup, I don't think that makes it completely unique, because I can think of a couple Bach 50s that I've seen that have that side by side trigger setup as well.
Yeah, it does seem like a fun solution to the dependent issue. Like, it's like, having to have your thumb engaged to engage your middle finger isn't as natural as having to have the bottom part of your thumb engaged to engage the top part. You're never gonna, like,
absolutely,
with the duo gravis, you're never gonna be like, oh, I forgot to engage the top trigger. like
Yeah.
like you're doing it naturally, right?
So it's funny you say that, because in marching band I played a Getzen Eterna. We actually did have a bass trombone in marching band, which I'm sure there's going to be people who hate that too. However, I played a Getzen Eterna that was a dependent horn, and it had the split trigger setup. And I've got to be honest, coming from my Yamaha Xeno, I really use that. I really do use that second trigger by itself quite a bit, especially for tuning like a low F in second position. Sometimes that's a little bit more convenient to hit there. And there's just a couple things there's a couple alternate positions, things like that I did with kind of a modified like Blair Bollinger exercises that my lessons teacher had me doing. And there's a lot of those things that I was so used to doing that almost became second nature. When I picked up that Getzen Eterna in a dependent setup, I was whiffing a lot of notes, and I had to remind myself. And I don't think that would even be possible to happen on something with that side by side triggers or those stack triggers like that. I think that has some merit, but it's a very, very small. I just don't see that being a whole reason to buy one. I don't know.
Yeah, man. I will say that if you are a bass trombonist and you have the horn you want and you're looking for something vintage, I think that would be a cool addition. I think we've made at least a solid argument to maybe if it's your only bass trombone, there's some oddity to that. But yeah, I think it's got like you said, it's kind of unfortunate that people are splitting the triggers. There's so many bass trombones that already do that, like kind of preserve one of the cool little factors on this bass trombone.
Yeah, see, I say this and I sound so opinionated. However, I wouldn't not buy a Duo Gravis if I saw a great deal on one now that I have the horn I want, like you said. It's just that wouldn't be my only choice for a bass trombone. And I would almost stray away from telling people that it's the perfect double for a tenor player just because you think that tenor trombone players don't know how to use their middle finger.
Yeah.
I think we're really underestimating the IQ of our fellow tenor trombone player by telling them that the Duo Gravis is the solution to all their problems.
All right, man. Do you have any more thoughts on independent versus dependent?
Yeah. So we really kind of went into a lot about just the Duo Gravis, but the independent versus dependent argument really boils down to, it really comes close to what George Roberts talking about the single versus double horn. A lot of people with the dependent horns, they like just the either, I've heard some people say they like the weight distribution of a dependent horn because those valves tend to be stacked. I've talked to a couple people who've said that. The main reason, however, is that I hear is that a dependent horn blows a little freer, and what that means is just has a little bit less resistance than an independent horn, and that's because whenever you are blowing into your trombone, you are only blowing past one rotor versus two rotors whenever you're blowing open, and then if you need to blow past two rotors, you press the trigger and you kind of engage that. So I've heard that as well. That argument has some serious validity, and that's the kind of argument that people like Doug Yo use. I cannot argue against that because I honestly believe that if you're more comfortable playing a horn in a certain way, that's when you're going to be playing your best. So I won't try to argue against that. However, coming from a teacher standpoint, again, if you're picking one instrument and you're a teacher, I highly suggest going with an independent setup just so that you can go through certain exercises with your students that you might not be able to do with a dependent horn. There's some alternate positions that we can talk about a little bit when we discuss tuning later, but there are just some things that you can do you might not necessarily be able to do with a dependent horn. And
I think that if you're in a teaching position, you don't need to completely block yourself off from being able to do that, especially since there's some really good books out there written for independent bass trombones. I mentioned this earlier, but the Blair Bollinger book is a favorite of mine. I did not mean to mention Blair Bollinger so much this episode, but and we'll talk even a little bit more. But I really do think that in the independent bass trombone world, he is a pioneer when it comes to the use of both triggers. Yeah, I think that's really what I had to say. I personally use an independent bass trombone, so that probably will show some of my bias. My trombone teacher, he suggested that too, though. And when I studied with a bass trombone, my first trombone teacher was a tenor trombone player. But even when I studied with a bass trombone player, I got a lot of the same sense that he respected a lot of the people's views with dependent horns. However, he was always strongly suggesting an independent for a lot of the same reasons that I'm saying now. That's really what I had to say. I'm not going to, like I said, if you guys, disagree, I'd love to hear why. But for the most part, I feel like from a teaching standpoint, keep in mind, I'm a teacher. I know Cody's planning on being a teacher. So that's kind of the way we go about it and the viewpoint that we're approaching things from. If you're just a bass trombone player all the time and you prefer a dependent horn, I mean, by all means, play a dependent horn. If you think that little bit less, or that little bit of more free-flowing air that you get through there, if you think that helps you out, by all means do that. I'm not saying anything against that. I'm just saying from a teaching standpoint, I feel like a independent is probably a wiser choice for teaching students from.
Yeah, man. If you have any, thoughts, please leave them in the comments. If you have hate mail directly for Ben, just email me and I'll forward it straight his way. And on that, we're going to take a little break. We'll be right back after this. All right, welcome back to the slideshow. All right, so I think we're going to talk about some different tuning issues, or not issues, but different tuning options for the bass trombone. What you got for us, Ben?
Yeah, so we mentioned about dependent versus independent, and this tuning subject goes hand in hand with that. So whenever we talk about tuning a bass trombone, I'm talking about just what the fundamental pitch is for that instrument when 0, 1, 2 attachments are activated at one time. So if you had an independent bass trombone, if you had a dependent bass trombone, your options would be playing your horn open, which would normally be B flat, playing your horn with one valve depressed, which would be an F, and then playing the horn with both valves depressed, which most commonly would put your horn in D. Now, for dependent bass trombones, it's relatively simple because you have your instrument can be tuned in 3 different pitches. With that comes the idea of the longer the horn is, the fewer positions you have actually to use. You have closer to 6 positions if you have the F attachment pressed down. And if you have both the F and the D attachment, or for example, depressed, you would probably have 5 positions on that trombone. And the positions definitely become further and further out from each other as you go. We'll talk about that. We'll discuss the most common tunings for bass trombone. I've already mentioned the one for a dependent bass trombone would be B flat, F, and D. One of the main reasons this is so common is because out in 5th position, or with both valves depressed and out with your slide out in 5th position, you can reach a B natural comfortably. So that is one of the reasons why
why that's a popular tuning is because it keeps things pretty close to the face, I guess, without too much change going on. And to me, it's a pretty natural tuning. And its counterpart on the independent horn would be a B flat, D, and G flat. The second valve can play a sharp G flat. I wouldn't use it for a true G flat. However, that second valve in a pinch could be used for that. But most commonly, it's used almost the exact same as the dependent horn setup, which is just, pressing both valves and playing a D. Now, from there are a lot of different tunings. I mentioned the Duo Gravis earlier that I played on. That was actually tuned in B flat, F, and E. That meant that the second attachment really only dropped the horn down another half step. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what positions each of those notes would be in. And also, it's pretty confusing to me. I really think that is just to give you just enough room on that slide to hit that C or that B natural if you absolutely need it. I don't know. That's kind of a weird tuning to me. It's not super common. It is a little bit more common in older horns, but that's not the norm for sure. Some other examples of tunings on an independent bass trombone, there's a B flat, F, B, and D. Now the B flat, F, B, and D is a pretty cool tuning. I just liked it because I actually almost bought a tuning slide for this one time when I was in college. I didn't have much money, but I was going to spend the money I had on this tuning slide. What that does is that drops your trombone with both triggers depressed to a B. So the low B natural would be in first position with both triggers depressed. With the second trigger depressed, it drops it to a D, and with the first, it's still an F. Now this, of course, is a much longer attachment than traditional attachments, and there were a couple custom jobs, but I did see some tuning slides for the Yamaha Xeno in this arrangement going out, and I almost bought one. They seem pretty cool. Once again, that's something that would probably take some getting used to, but I imagine it's somewhat viable. Once again, I'm not seeing any gaps there, but I still don't see it being as practical as the traditional tuning. Now, there is something that is a little bit more common than either of these called the Bollinger tuning. It gets its name from the bass trombonist Blair Bollinger, who we've talked about before. Blair plays an independent bass trombone tuned in B flat, F, E flat, and then a flat G. And he's got a couple reasons for this. Blair Bollinger, like I said, uses an independent horn. I would say he uses an independent horn probably to its fullest extent more than a lot of people do. And this is kind of what inspired me to really embrace the independent horn. So he actually plays his trombone to where he can play all of his major arpeggios in first position. And while that doesn't sound like a big deal, it does help out a little bit, especially in technical passages, apparently, is what he claims. But it's just a different way of playing. I think what he really brought to the table, though, was this idea that we could be using both of these valves independently of each other, because even when we had independent bass trombones, it's not like people were using the valves independently of each other that much. And I think Blair Bollinger kind of opened a lot of people's eyes to some of the possibilities of an independent bass trombone. So that's a pretty common one. I've played on a Bollinger tuning horn, but I just don't think you can give any horn a fair shake picking it up at a international trombone festival for 2 to 3 minutes. And to be honest, looking back on International Trombone Festival, man, that instrument showroom, I guess we all look at things through a different light now. But, with Corona and everything, I just couldn't imagine anything like that.
imagine hundreds of people in a room standing in line to play, a couple instruments while a bunch of other ones get unplayed. I specifically think about Rath's R90 Contra that they brought. But anyways, that's besides the point.
Yeah, man, I have a great picture of you playing that contrabass Rath with Mitch Rath looking like straight at you, like, don't drop my insanely expensive instrument.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the frown might have also been the fact that I was playing it pretty terribly. But
it's not tuned in B flat though, right? It's like a crazy. What's the tuning on a concert?
It is. There's a couple different tunings for. Oh man, Cody.
Right. I'm sorry. Just so you know, like
there's a European and an American contrabass tuning. Contrabass trombones in general are tuned in F, and they are almost always independent. But there's two different, or two very common contrabass trombone tunings, and I did not do research for contrabass trombone today.
Well, that'll be a future episode. Tune in later to learn about the contrabass trombone. When you thought we couldn't get any lower.
But I guess that is the point. The Contra was a great example of the independent horn being used correctly too, because you can only have arms that are so long, especially like mine. And if you saw the picture that Cody took of me, my arms definitely did not reach all the way out that F Contra. So Bollinger tuning, we talked about that. There are some more obscure tunings. There's a B flat F with a flat B, or a flat B flat to A, which would be C, with just the second one that's even bigger than the D. And then, of course, there's a myriad of dependent tunings. There's a B flat F E, B flat F E flat, a B flat F D flat, but like I said, the most common being B flat F and D. But that's really about tuning. I mean, I suggest you use what tuning you're comfortable with. It's important, though, that you know the limitations of each tuning. I stick with standard tuning, which is just B flat F D with a G flat. I really like that. I think from a teacher standpoint, that's a good way to go too. If I had to pick a second one, I would probably go Bollinger tuning. I mean, those are really the two big dogs in the game. And I say that, but I'm probably eventually going to get me one of those D attachments for my Yamaha at some point, just because it's fun. You can go, your trombone can play a little bit lower, and isn't that what bass trombonists tried to do anyways? I'm not saying I would ever use it in a playing situation, but might get me an attachment or a tuning slide just in case. Really, I think that's all I have to say about tuning.
Yeah, man. It's funny you mentioned the E with the Duo Gravis, because I was just thinking, my King 3BF little concert one I have over here has an E throw on it, which I've kind of had fun playing with, which means that it has like the trigger attachment has a tuning slide and then another tuning slide. So if I pull it all the way out, I can down tune it a whole half step, So maybe that was kind of like where they were coming from, was that they already had kind of the E thing on the 3B and they liked that. But, and I also, when I was studying with Michael Underwood, Dr. Michael Underwood, who's a principal trombone in the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra, he had his F attachment, he had another attachment to throw to, I think, drop it to an E. I can't remember what it was, but he had a different tuning. So, I mean, that's always fun if you want to try and switch out. I don't really have a ton to add to tuning. As it is, a lot of times I play with just the B flat, just the straight horn, and then do a bunch of false tones. But and if I do switch over, I have the F. But what do you have been? I know some people want to go into this. I don't want to go too crazy on this because this can get kind of all over the place, but just kind of like a brief overview of like some different valve options and kind of how that affects different things.
Okay, so valves, bass trombonist, and valves. Cody was always giving me, along with any other bass trombonist, a hard time because we sometimes have a slight obsession with valves. If you're looking at a horn, you're asking, hey, what kind of valve is that? You know, maybe to his credit, maybe we kind of overdo it with our obsession with it. However, I think it's important when you're going to deal with two of them a lot of the time. So we have 1,000 different options, but the most common ones that you see right now anyways are going to be axial flow. The axial flow valves can be kind of seen in a couple different examples. You have Thayer valves, the OE Thayers. I know some people who had those. Those are pretty sweet valves. They're a little bit more free blowing than a standard rotor. They do require more maintenance, some more grime and stuff can get to them. And I've even heard some things about the throw on those valves being weird. To be honest, I don't know a ton about axial flow valves. I've fooled with them a little bit. I've played on a couple horns with them while my horn was in the shop before, and I wasn't a huge fan, but I know they have a pretty big following. Most common type of valve is going to be a rotor valve. I use straight rotors. There's nothing special about the rotors I used. For bass trombones, they are going to usually be bigger, a good bit bigger. A rotor valve, for the most part, is going to require less maintenance. When you do have to maintain a rotor, I will say it's not easy taking out. I've done it a couple times with my bass trombone, but for the most part, I'm going to be honest, my rotors could probably use a cleaning, and I have just been too lazy to take the time and pop them out. I don't know if you've messed with that at all, Cody, but it's not fun.
Yeah, for a little bit. I I will say I also, by the way, just have straight rotors. I've messed with the Thayer valve a little bit, but as far as cleaning them, I've noticed like an insane pickup in speed whenever I've taken it into the shop and had my guy clean them. So yeah, I guess I guess I should take better care of my rotors. I mean, you know, also I don't use one every day, so it's not up in my mind. The rotor I do have on this BAC is a German made from a company called Open Flow, and I think that's the name of the company. Maybe that's the type of the valve. I'm not sure. I should know. I know a lot about this horn. Like I can tell you where the trigger wood is from, so I should be able to tell you a whole bunch about the valve, but I unfortunately can't. Like Ben was just saying, I don't obsess over them like some people do. But that was the only piece of the horn that Mike didn't make himself. I mean, there is a lot of like lore around rotor building. I mean, Thayer is named after Ed Thayer. Like that was what he did. He like made he made valves and became kind of famous. So, you know, if you're a little kid out there listening to this right now, I truly believe that there's still improvements / like ground to be made on the valve front. I don't know how much you could get done with the belt. You know, that's pretty straightforward. But I think that we, in the next 50 years or whatever, might see some cool improvements. I mean, like you said, the what is it, the axial flow or the new Bach one? That's like supposedly brand new. I don't know what all they have going on with that.
So axial flow is kind of like the generic term for what most people know as a Thayer. But yeah, Bach has an infinity valve that they claim is kind of in their mind a perfected version of the axial flow, though I've seen people have had issues with that. You know, and you're talking about ground being made. I don't know if anybody remembers the Bach K valve, but those are notoriously tough valves to deal with. They did not last very long, apparently. I know some people still like them, and once again, there's probably a cult following there, but I know the general consensus on the K valve is that there have been enough improvements that is no longer needed. The K valve was kind of like a knockoff of the Thayer valve before Bach managed to get. Bach had OE Thayers, I'm pretty sure, for a bit. At least I think so, because a guy I played in the orchestra with had a Bach 50 with a OE Thayer on it. I know he didn't get any custom work done. So
Yeah, I'll say that too. I know that when it comes to custom work, valves are one place where it can happen a lot. I do see people trying to they find something they like and they'll throw it on their concert horn if it's not stock. So, yeah. I mean, did we talk about Hogmans at all, man?
No. So Hogman valves are pretty popular in the bass trombone community as well. Think of it kind of like a hybrid, I guess. They look like a rotor just flipped on its side. Supposedly, the point of it is your air doesn't change direction as much. That's the idea behind a axial flow as well. But you still get a lot of the seal that you get with a rotor valve. That's one thing that people like about rotors compared to axial flow is that sometimes axial flow valves tend to be a little leaky, though not all, while rotor valves tend to have a pretty good seal, but people sometimes call them stuffy. So Hogman's kind of that middle ground there where you keep your air flowing in the same direction, but it's still a rotor with a good seal. There's, like I said, there's thousands of different valves there's Rotax. There probably are one or two piston valve trombones out there. I couldn't imagine a world where that doesn't exist because people have done it all.
I mean, yeah, like I said at the beginning of this, we could go on a whole episode just deep diving all these valves, but we'd need to do a lot more research and come a lot more prepared before we did that. And B, as controversial as we've been this whole episode, I'm sure to some, I don't mean to offend anyone. Whatever your valve you like the most is the best. I promise you. That's our stance on it.
Yeah.
All right. Before we wrap up here, do the album recommendation of the week. We've been doing a bunch of jazz stuff, and so only fitting to this episode, I figured we'd do a bass trombonist. We did talk a lot about Blair Bollinger, and that's going to be the album recommendation this week is an album he did called Fancy Free. The album has a number of different compositions from composers such as Robert Spillman and Tomasi. The Tomasi piece on there is actually a trombone quartet piece, To Be or Not to Be. And it's the same quartet from Four of a Kind, the first album recommendation we did. That, if you don't remember, that had Joe Alessi, Mark Lawrence, Scott Hartman, and Blair Bollinger. I mean, he currently teaches at the Curtis Institute, which is what a lot of people playing in the Philadelphia Orchestra end up doing. That's our album recommendation. One fun thing I'll say on that is he does some solo stuff. I think the first piece he does Spain, which is, in case you're wondering, not the same as the famous Chick Corea composition Spain. My teacher told me to go check it out because there's a moment where he's playing and then he stops and breathes and it's just super, super loud. So if you want to hear, if you want a teaching example for your kids to be like, hey, what should it sound like when I breathe? Like, you can hear it, and it's nuts how much air he's taking in, and he's just ripping it up too. I think that's going to do it for this week. Do you have any final thoughts, Ben?
No. I think that one of the biggest things here is that if you're going to look into buying a bass trombone, especially an old one, be sure to look into some of these things about the configuration and everything. Like, I know you're in the market for a bass trombone, Cody, so I think it's a great time for you to think about kind of what you're looking for, because what was popular a long time ago might not be what's being used today, and you might find some things are being aged out. Like I said, the FE tuning and things like that.
Yeah, man. That'll do it for this week. And as always, happy shedding.